Good morning and welcome to NAMI New Jersey's webinar series. My name is Meredith Mason-Blount and I'm the Executive Director with NAMI New Jersey. Today's topic is managing substance abuse during times of crisis. And we are very honored to have our speaker today, Audra Tenero, join us. Audra is a LPC, a licensed professional counselor and a licensed clinical alcohol and drug counselor, and is a speaker, clinician, and owner of Cross Street Counseling, LLC in Madison, New Jersey. Audra is well-versed in mental health and substance abuse concerns and have been practicing for over 20 years. Audra's approach is integrative, pulling from motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy, interpersonal therapy, and harm reduction. Audra's approach is conversational, collaborative, and direct. Audra is also the Assistant Director of Counseling and Psychological Services at Drew University, where she has worked with students for almost 20 years. In her practice, Audra works with adolescents, young adults, and families. She has a particular expertise working with emerging, current, and former college students and assisting with life transitions. Audra, we are very grateful to have you here, and we're looking forward to the presentation. I will now pass it over to you.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here today, and I'm really grateful that you asked me to come in. So I'd like to get started talking about our goals for today. Okay. So the things that I hope that you'll take away is understanding the emotional responses, specifically in the face of a pandemic, and how they relate to and potentially influence substance use. I'd like to talk about recognize the overlap of mental health and substance use, and discuss potential harm reduction techniques, and especially ending with how to develop ways to deal with another's use. I feel like in this pandemic, and people have been stuck in the house with each other, different issues have emerged, and I think it's important to kind of cover how we can best work with each other. I've also integrated throughout the presentation a Q&A stop. So if you do have any questions, I'll be stopping at some parts after I get to different informational slides. So I'd like to start kind of with emotional responses to this pandemic specifically. I mean, a pandemic is something that none of us have ever experienced before, and when we think about crisis type situations, there's usually a bookend, an end, a beginning, an end, and right now it feels like this is just on a loop. So when I actually made the slide, I made it much more linear. And then I thought, well, that's not right, because this is really all over the place. When you respond to something like this, we started out with uncertainty. There was a lot of fear, projection. If you follow the guidance of how to keep yourselves and other people safe, there could be a level of isolation. I feel like right now we've hit this point of fatigue. Actually, maybe that was about a month ago where I hit the point of fatigue myself. Negative thinking, potentially poor coping mechanisms. And now as we're kind of looking at the rest of the country, New Jersey's doing pretty well and other places are increasing again. And so are we hitting a second wave? Like, there's that uncertainty again. And there's that projection of like, when will this be over? And we don't know. And so I think it's important for people to recognize that, you know, in response to these uncertain situations, there is no right or wrong emotion. There is no right or wrong response. Emotions vary and can change over time. So I like this picture because I think that it shows us that, you know, there is a continuum to our emotional responses. And when we, and so if we think about the descriptions on the other slide, and we know that there's isolation, uncertainty, there's different emotional reactions, I'd like to kind of break this slide down a little bit and think about it in terms of not rights or wrongs, but really being able to monitor where people are at. So if you're in the excelling, thriving area, I would say you're having minimal to no symptoms, you're able to use this as an indicator that you're managing the stress, you're managing mental health, you're managing substance use, you're doing well. You're kind of taking things as they come and moving forward from there. If we look at more of the unsettled, I would say the descriptor for that would be, you know, maybe you're having more of an up and down. Maybe the experience has some good days, some not so good days. You're able to recognize things that you're not doing well for yourself and able to make adjustments in your daily routines. Struggling would be more ups and downs and likely less ability to cope and manage the symptoms that are happening. And then obviously the crisis is the crisis point where we really need some level of intervention and things aren't going well. We don't look at these as, again, good or bad. They're how are we using our adaptive coping skills. Emotions are things that just happen. We don't have control over our emotions. We don't have control over our thoughts. They just happen, but we do have control over how we respond and what kind of behavior we incorporate. It's best to think of it in terms of if you're in that green area, you're doing the self-wellness stuff that you need to make sure that you continue to thrive. Think that part of being in this pandemic is that we need to establish routines. We need to check in with ourselves on a daily basis and see how we're doing. We need to be able to monitor what's going on and see if we're managing our symptoms well. So if you have a personal check-in every single day, it's how am I feeling? And being able to identify the different emotions that you're experiencing. What am I reacting to? Am I reacting to something? What's happening in my day? Am I feeling like very isolated? Am I lessening up on my routine? Am I not eating well? Am I feeling really lonely? Am I feeling out of control? Am I feeling, you know, what am I reacting to? What's happening? Am I feeling isolated? You know, the quarantine, the social isolation, we need to continue to emotionally connect with people, even if we can't socially connect with people. And then what about media intake? I feel like right now with kind of numbers shifting, especially around the country, we're checking in on the news a lot more. We're seeing what's going on with the media, and we're constantly kind of curating the information that comes into us. The social media connections, what are other people doing? There's a level of frustration when we see people out and about, maybe not social distancing, maybe not using masks. You know, we get all kind of wrapped up in what's happening with social media. Am I anxious? Am I depressed? Are there other intense emotions? And then a check-in of what skills can I use to maybe better manage these feelings for what's happening to me. Let's say substance use is something that people kind of go to, right? Maybe it's one of the things that somebody uses if they're not feeling well. It's probably not the most healthy coping skill, but I think the personal check-in would be able to identify whether or not you're doing things that are helpful as far as, you know, managing the sadness, managing the isolation in a way that's not necessarily going to Zoom happy hours all the time. Maybe it's just Zoom dinners, or maybe you're doing the Netflix film parties and kind of interacting with people in a way that's not just alcohol related, getting out, walking around, maybe exercising, maybe doing something that you find really fun, whether it be a puzzle or some kind of a game or connecting with your family. So using the daily check-in can really be helpful when we're looking at what's happening with substance use in the face of this emotional distress. So that kind of brings me to the next topic, which is abstinence or harm reduction. So if you have someone who has a substance use issue, let's say, at times abstinence is definitely warranted, it's indicated. Some situations, it's the way to go, especially if somebody is dependent upon something. You need to initially get them to abstain to get them to a more stabilized area. But then there's also kind of a harm reduction technique or idea. My training was basically working with adolescents in intensive outpatient programs. I did some aftercare work after kids came out of rehabs. And then I kind of moved into working with college students. So my initial training was all about abstinence and abstinence-based recovery. But if you work with college students, then you know the minute that you bring up the word abstinence, if that's your only go-to thing, if that's your only go-to, you know, kind of helpful tactic for them, it's a really short conversation sometimes. And so I had to really relearn some different ways to approach people and their substance use. So while abstinence may end up being the ultimate goal, harm reduction is something that can help people gain some insight into their using patterns, their drinking patterns, what's happening with them, what are they gaining from them, what are they losing from them, how can they basically change what their interaction is with their substance to reduce the harm associated with it. So it's definitely been an interesting learning experience over 20 years of using harm reduction, because I was able to, you know, if you say to somebody, you just need to abstain and the conversation ends, they really don't gain anything into what's happening with them. If you're able to work from harm reduction and be able to identify some life areas for them that are, they're able to identify some life areas for themselves actually, then they might have more of a success of learning a little bit more about themselves, gaining some insight, being able to set some goals, and hopefully have some success in that realm. So when I work with people related to their substance use, I don't use this criteria much as like a diagnostic tool. I use it more to help give very specific ideas to my clients about what is it that we're looking at. So if you look at the criteria, it's tolerance, obviously needing more of something to feel the effects of it. It's binge use. I do a lot of binge work with college students, right? So that's more the episodic, very high levels of high risk drinking that go on, or drug use. Maybe people have identified a need to cut down or stop and they're unable to. Maybe they're having some cravings, they're negating their responsibilities, they're more focused on their drinking, their drug use, instead of the things that they need to be doing, work, school, different stuff like that. They've given up some social, occupational, recreational activities, negative impact on relationships, despite consequences, continue to use, withdrawal symptoms. So these criteria really kind of give us an idea of when people can identify things that are happening, they can see that maybe there's a mild issue, a moderate issue, or a severe issue, right? Substance use disorder is now broken down into those three categories. And that would give you an idea of whether or not harm reduction would be warranted. So when we think about substance use, it's also on a continuum, right? So we talk about our emotions being on a continuum. They kind of happen, they move up, they move down. We can institute some skills to bring them back to, you know, feeling more comfortable. If somebody has obviously no use, then there's no use, right? So they're not engaging in any substance use. And then we have a level of experimentation where maybe they use a little bit, they've tried something, it's episodic, maybe it's 1-2 times, it's nothing really that warrants a lot of concerns. Then we have social occasional use. So this use is really, if we think back to our criteria, there would be nothing in that criteria that would connect with social use, occasional use. It's fairly controlled. There's no consequences associated with it. It's a couple of drinks here and there. It's episodic, occasional use. it's well within the person's decision and kind of control for deciding what happens and how much of it happens. Then we have the binge use, which is definitely an abuse pattern. And so the goal of the binge use is short period of time, high, a lot of consumption, definitely looking to impair yourself, definitely looking to feel, differently or to not feel, right? If we're relating this back to our emotions, if there's binge use happening and it's emotionally connected, it might be because you don't want to experience what you're experiencing. Binge use with college students really becomes more of kind of a social highlight thing. And I do a lot of work with college students talking about BACs and the risks associated with drinking so much in a short period of time. So some of the issues along the continuum for binge use would be blackouts, it would be alcohol poisoning, it would be having regrets, maybe taking a long time to recover from the effects of alcohol. And so if we connect that to something like the pandemic, if we think about all the Zoom happy hours that started popping up all over the place, people could potentially see themselves binging or losing count of what they're doing or losing track of what's going on, and the alcohol becomes a little bit of an escape. Then we have the mild abuse. If we think back to the criteria, that's about 2 or 3 of those identifiers. And so mild abuse is something that, maybe it seems like it's pretty well controlled. There are some consequences to use, not super significant, maybe not constant, maybe they're occasional. There's definitely an ebb and flow to what goes on as far as that goes. And then we have moderate abuse, which would be more consequences associated. So we would think of that in terms of maybe increased blackouts, increased situations where person wanted to only drink, use in a certain way, and they were not able to maintain that. Maybe they are now having some relationship issues connected to it. Maybe somebody is really expressing some concerns and they're not able to keep their use in like what we would call kind of a controlled situation where they're kind of making choices around it. And then we have, I'm sorry, I can't see I have to move this over. Okay. And then we have severe abuse. And I would say severe abuse is something a little bit more like when somebody is addicted to something, when somebody has a physical dependency. It might not always be the case, but likely it is. They're experiencing many negatives associated to their use. They're definitely using more than they had anticipated. Their relationships are likely to be affected. Their priorities are shifting, meaning that they are probably using more so than engaging in other things that they should be doing, like work, like family time, like friend time, different things like that. So it's a different level. So I would say if we look at this continuum, harm reduction could be indicated in a lot of these areas, but I would probably say in the severe abuse area, it would likely not be indicated. And the reason would be if there is a physical dependency, and if there's physical dependency, we know that you can really be physically and psychologically dependent upon alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, right? Benzos, different things like that. The only 2 substances that you could not reduce and do on your own, like, so if you're physically addicted to alcohol, if you're physically addicted to benzos, it would not be advised for you to try to reduce your use on your own. You definitely need to go into a detox or work with some kind of a medical professional for that. So right there, I'm kind of stop and see if there are any questions before we get in a little further to the harm reduction.
If you have any questions, you can throw them into the Q&A box now. Audra, I think we're good right now. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Okay. So the harm reduction approach, obviously, if physical dependence is indicated, this approach may not be recommended. So the goal of harm reduction is to prevent or reduce negative consequences associated with use and improve mental health. So I'm going to go back to the continuum where I said, like, if you look at the mild use, the moderate use, or the severe use, there's lack of control around being able to manage your own use. And so you might say, well, how is harm reduction going to work if somebody's been on that continuum and they actually can't manage their own use? Every time they start to use, they kind of go overboard. Well, I would say it's because there's a lack of insight, right? The mind that got us into the situation is not the mind that can get us out of the situation. And so what do we need to do? Harm reduction gives us an opportunity to gain some insight into what's going on around our use. Like, what are the emotional triggers maybe? What are the situations that bring me to a place where I lose control? Am I drinking, drugging to change the way that I feel? Am I using it as a coping skill? Is it my only coping skill? Have I gotten rid of all of my other coping skills, right? So, you know, when you come to somebody and you say, I have some real concerns about your substance use, I really think you need to stop, that may be really jarring for people to hear. It might be what needs to happen. And again, abstinence may end up being the goal, the result. But in the beginning, we need to meet people where they're at. And something we know about substance abusers is that the denial can be really strong and the defenses can be really strong. They're not happy with what's happening with their substance use as it goes with consequences, right? People don't feel good when they wake up in the morning and they can't remember what happened the night before, or they know that they got into an argument with their significant other, or they know that they let a family member down. Like, that doesn't feel good. And so then we end up in this perpetual cycle of trying to avoid. Harm reduction will give us an opportunity to kind of look at those life areas and be able to make some inroads with someone to try and learn new skills, to try and put more arrows in the quiver, if you will, to be able to manage their emotional reactions so that their substance use remains in control. So one of the first things you want to do with people, if you're going to use harm reduction, is to identify areas in their life that are impacted by their use and abuse. And so it really is just kind of an inventory of, like, different life areas. How are things going? What could be better? What do you notice, right? It's using a little bit of motivational interview to say to the person, how are things going in this area? How do you feel about this? What's happening there? Do you feel like, you know, things can improve in this area? Instead of judging and pointing out the things that you believe as a clinician or a family member or somebody that loves someone who is a substance abuser, that you feel are their issues, giving them the opportunity to be able to, you know, evaluate, assess what's going on, right? Even to say something like, you know, did you mean to get to that place the other night? Did you mean to drink or use that much that you were not, you know, able to remember the next day when you woke up? And to be able to have people identify those things. Set goals and limits around use. Now, it's not for us to set goals and limits. It really is for the person. Once they begin to identify their life areas, it's really like, okay, so what do you think would be helpful during this time? What do you think would be, you know, where would you want to be along with like your use? So if you were drinking, would it be a certain amount of drinks? If you were smoking pot, would it be, you know, only using at certain times? Like, what are the goals and limits around use? There's a lot of times that I do alcohol education, obviously marijuana education, and other drug education as far as limits and amounts go. I talk a lot about THC and the high levels and high concentrations of THC and the dab pens and the difference between dab pens, edibles, and smoking just the regular flower. Talk a lot about alcohol use. You know, if you're a 150-pound male or 140-pound female, one drink raises your BAC around a 0.02. Give people some kind of a an idea, something to kind of refer back to. So if you have X amount of drinks in a certain period of time, you're likely to be, you know, over the legal limit. What does that mean? What are you feeling at that point? That will also help you to gauge tolerance, to be able to see how much somebody needs in order to feel something, which is really good to check in with, because not everybody's 100% honest with how much they're drinking. There's a little shame or embarrassment sometimes connected with that. So if you can use this information to make sure that harm reduction is a good idea and that it's not going to put them in a life-threatening situation, you can kind of work with that as well. Engage in professional if needed. If you're working with somebody and you feel like this is outside of your realm, or if you're trying to help a family member and you feel like this is well outside of your realm, you know, consulting an LCADC or somebody who has a background in substance use would be really helpful at that point. And then once the person has identified their life areas that are being impacted, set some goals and limits around use, you want to keep checking in. How's it going? You want to review it. You want to assess the effectiveness. You want to make adjustments as needed. So it's constantly like a moving treatment plan, right? So it's not about just saying to people, okay, this is what you do and you move along from here and, you know, we'll see ya. It's more about being there and making it non-judgmental, making it accepted enough to be able to come in and say, I overdid it. And then being able to kind of peel back the layers of that. What does that mean? You overdid it. Okay, so let's go back and let's review. What was happening that week? What was happening that day? What was happening that night? What were you feeling? What were you thinking? At what point did you use any of your other skills? And we'll talk about those in a minute. To be able to, A, hold a person accountable to sticking with their goals and their limits, and B, to be able to say, you know what, sometimes we all take a misstep and this is a learning process, so we need to go back and make sure that we're addressing the things that we need to be addressing. So there are some strategies that will help people to support their reduction goals. So it's not about just saying, okay, don't do this. It's about learning how to incorporate other things, other coping skills, other strategies in. So the first one is use a network for support. Having somebody identify who they could reach out to in a time of need. If they're thinking about going overboard, if they have gone overboard, if they need some form of assistance, who is their network? Who are their go-to people? Listing that out is really helpful. Understanding what's in our control and what's not, right? I mean, sometimes we're experiencing, especially in the face of this pandemic, so much emotional information, so much emotional reaction, so much uncertainty. It's kind of like, okay, I need to remember that I am, you know, everything that's inside the hula hoop that I'm standing in is what I can control. And that's just me. And everything else is outside, and that's what I can't control. And so are you rationally kind of looking at things and getting yourself worked up over stuff that you can't control, things that you need to learn how to process and let go? These are strategies, because if you've identified that your substance use is really kind of enmeshed with this emotional reaction, it's going to be important to reframe that. And we'll get into that a little bit later. Learning how to be comfortable with discomfort. So this is really a tough one for people, because if you find yourself in the cycle of use, abuse, and you're uncomfortable, and that's one thing that kind of leads to the overdoing it of substances, you know, you have to learn the person has to learn how to sit through that, be uncomfortable, breathe, understand it, almost embrace it, and then kind of move forward from it. And we're going to get into that a little bit further as well. The next one would be express your challenges. So again, when you're assessing and reviewing your strategies, saying, you know what, I put this down as a goal, and this is really difficult because once I got to this point, it became really challenging to stay within my right mind and make good decisions for myself. Oh, okay. So what I hear you saying is that you need to be less intoxicated to make good decisions. All right, so how do we do that, right? So expressing challenges, giving somebody an ability to be able to say that, because that's a really important conversational point. It normalizes and validates that behavior change is not easy in any sort of a situation, specifically in something like this. Participate in something. Sometimes people have fallen out of things that make them feel better. One thing that we know about experience with anxiety and depression is those symptoms will pull you away from the things that will actually make you feel better, right? We know that connecting with people and not being in isolation is great for depression. It's really helpful in the long run. But when you're really depressed, it's hard for you to want to connect with anybody. So those symptoms really pull us away from the things that we know are going to help us. If you have lost your job or, are just working from home and are really feeling like you're climbing the walls at this point, participation in something can give somebody something else to do, right? Even if it's Zooming, if it's not a Zoom happy hour, right? It could be Zooming in for community, for volunteering, finding a cause that you really feel passionate about, getting yourself back connected to something. There is something so rewarding about being involved. And I think encouraging somebody to use that as a strategy is great, especially now. Engage with a mental health substance abuse specialist. I mean, obviously, if you're struggling, that's a great idea. And knowledge of somebody else's boundaries, consequences of continued use. I feel like if you know that somebody is not going to tolerate the continued backslide of what's happening, and there are boundaries in place and there are consequences in place, it does help to drive behavior. It does help to have somebody become more motivated to follow through. Maybe not always, right? Really depends on where they are in the continuum, but it is something that's really important. And if not for the person that's using, really important for the person that's dealing with somebody else who's using, right? So something that, again, we see a lot right now is that people are stuck at home with each other, and that can be a good thing, and it can also be a real struggle. And then developing healthy coping strategies. And that can be everything from exercising, daily routines, getting yourself out, getting yourself connected with people. Social distancing is really important, but that doesn't mean that we can't emotionally connect with people. Meeting a friend in the park, going and sitting outside, wearing your mask, whatever you feel comfortable with. And we're going to talk further about those in the next slide. So if we think about the strategies to support the reduction goals, reframing, understand what is in our control and what is not in our control. We need to reframe things, right? To be able to look at them from a more rational lens. Like if somebody feels like, this situation is the worst and it's never going to get any better, what we've really seen is that there have been some improvements specifically in our area. And so we know the things that are working well, and we can just manage what we can manage. You can wear your mask, you can social distance, you can do the right thing. We need to let everything else kind of go. We have to hope that the researchers are going to find an antidote, and that we're going to be able to, have people in government make good decisions, like all of that kind of stuff. What is in our control? What is outside of our control? What's in our control maybe is that we can have a schedule, have a routine. I know I keep going back to that. I feel like that's really important because it kind of gives some structure to our day where there really is at times not a lot of structure. The being comfortable with discomfort really kind of goes back down to emotional regulation. It's recognizing that strong feelings happen, right? So let's go back to, we have no control over our thoughts and feelings. They just happen. We do have control over how we react to them. When we're coming from an emotional regulation place, it's really thinking about, okay, I feel really uncomfortable. I don't feel good right now. I know that if I drink, if I drug, it's going to numb that out. I'm not going to feel it. And that's just kind of what I want to do. But we also know at the other end of that, that emotional feeling, that discomfort comes right back again. A lot of times it bounces up even higher than it was before, right? So working with people to be comfortable with discomfort, to realize that uncomfortable scenarios, uncomfortable emotions, they last, but they're typically not ongoing. They have maybe spikes, maybe then they have like some drop downs. How can people regulate their emotions? And so some of the really good things to do would be breathing exercises, 4 square breathing, grounding exercises to kind of bring you, I say to clients, it kind of brings you out of up here and kind of brings you into the room in this space. It brings you more into the here and the now, and recognize, where is this feeling coming from? What is the thought associated with this feeling? And what can I do? So sometimes I say to people, you know what, when you're feeling this, maybe time it and see how long this uncomfortable feeling lasts. And do we need to, I'm sorry, the screen moved and it knocked me a little out. So thinking about, what do we have as far as emotional feelings? Okay, I'll go back. So it's kind of like thinking about, if you're operating all the way up here, kind of bringing it into the room, bringing it into the space, breathing, calming yourself down. Think about maybe timing how long the discomfort takes. If you really want to act on that discomfort, maybe setting a limit. I'm going to try to sit with this or work through this for the next 20 or 30 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, just to see how I'm doing. It allows people to then push the pause button, right? Because when there's discomfort, at times there's impulsivity that comes along with that. And so I think if we can let people, validate for people that this discomfort happens, and that usually it has a beginning and an end, and that the feeling sometimes will dissipate. What else can they engage in for that short period of time? Maybe they could take a walk. Maybe they could call a friend. Maybe they could have a meal if they haven't eaten something. They need to check in with their self-care. Obviously breathing, maybe coloring, maybe going on their phone, looking at an app, doing something like that, checking in with a show, something that will kind of give some time. And then I even think journaling is a great idea. And I will tell my clients all the time, please then sit down and kind of write out what happened for you. And then we can talk about how to really address that later. And another strategy is being able to identify personal consequences associated with use. So what does that mean? Being able, to say, if I continue to feed into overusing, I could potentially lose my family, lose my spouse, whatever. And know that in no uncertain terms, these are things that really are kind of being held over your head a little bit, right? And so for some people, that could really be a motivation for change. For other people, it could be a motivation for change, but their use could be so on the continuum where it's really difficult for them to kind of pull themselves together, knowing that that would be an indicator of maybe a higher level of care, maybe, maybe reestablishing the goals, maybe abstinence is something that needs to happen in the short term. And then, once they're stabilized and things are going well, they can revisit whether or not abstinence is something that they want to do. But again, it's gaining that insight. What is working? What is helpful? What is motivating? What is not? So at this point, are there any questions? Because I just have a couple more slides left, but I know that that's a lot of information.
Great, thank you. We had a question about a lot of our NAMI family members are starting to encounter marijuana use.
Yeah.
And wanted to know if at some point you can discuss it, maybe now or later in the presentation, about how to look at marijuana use in young people, especially when they're dealing with mental illness, and then what are the risks of using marijuana with serious mental illness, and then even with the culture of pot's not really a big deal.
Yeah. I can address that now. I can address that later. It's, THC is a topic all its own right now. There are so many changes that have happened with THC over the past couple of years that I feel like I had to go back to school myself, like, because all of a sudden everything changed. It was pot and then it was not, and it's dab pens and it's edibles and it's high concentrations. And so one thing that we do know is that it is more risky right now to be using something like those dab pens. The concentration of THC in those pens could be all the way up to 99% THC. So just to give you a little bit of a kind of a conceptualization, in the 90s, the THC level in the flower was between 6 and 12%. That's kind of gone up, right? So right now we've got, bud flower, that's about, the highest I think that they're finding is like 25, 30% of THC, right? So that's the active ingredient that actually gets you high. The dab pens, the oils, the waxes, they have concentrations all the way up to 99% THC. So there are two active ingredients that they know exist. There's many, many more, but the ones that we know the most information about are CBD and THC. So CBD is not the thing that gets you high. THC is the thing that gets you high. But if you think back to the 90s when there was 12% THC, the way that it always worked in nature was that the lower level of THC, there would be a higher level of CBD. So CBD is kind of the calming agent that helps the THC to not be so intensive, right? So I liken it this way when I work with people. It's, THC is the hot sauce and CBD is the milk, right? When you have too much hot sauce and your mouth is on fire, you drink milk to bring it down, okay? So if you think of it in terms of that, the dab pens really are just all hot sauce, no milk, right? So what do we know about that? Well, we don't know a lot, right? But we can surmise from the past. So we do know that marijuana has affected people's memory and has affected people's motivation and has exacerbated at times psychotic episodes. So what we do know right now is that I have seen and I have read about higher incidence of psychotic reactions to kids that are using the dab pens, whether they have psychosis in their family or not. So that's new because it was usually just really connected to family members. So kids or people who had psychosis in the family, if they were using marijuana, they put themselves at higher risk. Now it's everybody is taking that same risk on. If at 6 to 12% THC, it was affecting our memory and motivation and depression and anxiety, you can guarantee at 90% THC it's doing exactly the same thing, likely more issues. In my personal practice, what I've seen is that there's a lot of emotional dysregulation that comes from kids that are using marijuana on a regular basis. So I don't know, you may want to start with a harm reduction situation with them, and I have. We really kind of talk about what the negatives are associated with it, what's not going well, what is going well. They tend to try to have some control over it. It's really difficult because the access is so high. When you're using a dab pen, it doesn't smell like regular bud does. If you're eating an edible, somebody might not even know that you're under the influence because it just doesn't present in the same way. So that's actually really like a larger question in itself. When I work with teens, I work with them and their parents, and we sit down and we come up with a plan together. And then we work on that plan together, and we have very clear consequences. And I say consequences meaning when would a higher level of care be appropriate? And so I have had kids that are able to really manage it and step away from it and really recognize and gain a lot of insight. I've also had kids that absolutely cannot. They can't stop. They're using it in a way to manage their depression and anxiety so much that the minute that they're not using it, their anxiety and depression just go through the roof, right? So that is really very difficult. I have sent some kids to rehab, and then they come out and they're definitely in a more stabilized place where we can gain that insight and understanding and recognize that marijuana went from a want to a need, right? I talk about a lot of wants to needs. And that kind of means that you were in that social occasional want and you went to a need, moderate maybe to severe use. So I hope that that's a good kind of understanding.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay.
That's great.
And if you have more questions about that later, we can get to them at the end. So dealing with somebody else's use. So I love this picture because I feel like, you know, we're there, but there's a boundary, right? There has to be some lines. There has to be some limits set. There has to be some communication about my discomfort of what's going on with you and how are you going to take some responsibility for that. So in communication and boundary setting, I think it's first of all really important. So intervention obviously depends on the level of the disordered use, right? If you're dealing with somebody who's severely addicted to something, they're physically addicted to something, and they really can't even attend to what you're saying, I would say that needs probably more of a professional intervention to kind of get that person to even be receptive to what's going on around them. And you might not be able to do any good communication while somebody's really not within their right, straight mind. But if they're in the moderate, mild use area, communicating specific concerns. So going back to that criteria information that I gave you and not using it as a diagnosis, but using it as a springboard of, I have this specific concern because I've seen you do this, this, and this. And that happened in the past week, or, you know, whatever. Being very specific and concrete is better than you're driving me crazy, right? I can't do this anymore because you're driving me crazy. Well, what does that even mean? So being specific, being concrete, gives somebody feedback and information about how their use is affecting you in a negative way. Maybe then sit down and listen to their goals, right? Are you going to work on this? How are you going to work on this? You know, to have somebody just say, I'm going to change. That's not right. The mind that got us into it is not the mind that can get us out of this, right? We really need to change the way we're approaching things, right? And behavior change is difficult. So being able to verbalize, communicate, establish some goals is really important, because it says that there's some insight happening into how this is not just happening in a vacuum to the person who's the substance abuser. It's happening to everyone that has to be around them. And then I think it's important for you to identify your boundaries. I say to people all the time, do not put something out there that you're not willing to follow through with, right? If you're at the point where this is a deal breaker for you, you need to be very sure that this is a deal breaker for you and what that means, because if not, then it just becomes a threat. It becomes something that's not consistent. It becomes something that's not really enforced. If we say our boundaries out of fear and anger, they're usually well over the top of what we're actually going to follow through with, right? So it's always important to be really calm and kind of maybe even write them out a little bit, maybe sit on them. You know, we don't start communicating specific concerns, listen to somebody's goals, and set our boundaries all on the same day, right? This is a process. This is something that can take some time. Consistency is important. Knowing what you're absolutely going to follow through with, right? Knowing that if this person goes over the line and you've set a boundary and said, you know, the next time that you go over the line, we need to go see somebody, you need to investigate for somebody, you know, you need to find somebody that you guys can go see before that person maybe has a slip up. And then if they have a slip up, you can say, we said we're going to go find somebody and we're going to be able to act on this now, as opposed to now I have to start researching it, because then we kind of get into the place where it's not necessarily a consistent enforcement. And then recognize maybe your need for help. Maybe you're really pulled in by somebody's use and you're really in the rescue mode and want to make everything better and want to try to, you know, take a lot of the responsibility, a lot of the control off of the person. A harm reduction approach can actually put more responsibility and control on the other person and less about you. They're identifying the goals. They're assessing their progress. They're identifying what's not working in their life. And it's not you telling them what's not working and you setting the goals for them. It's them being able to recognize how they can do it for themselves. And so if you find yourself in that, you know, we're constantly up and down, and every time my spouse or my friend or whoever kind of gets into that crisis-y mode, think all the way back to the emotional stuff, right? When they get into that really dark orange red zone, am I mobilizing and am I fixing? And if that's the case, then maybe you really need to go to somebody to kind of learn how to step back, establish those boundaries, learn what you can control, learn what's outside of your control, and change the way that you're reacting. And so, you know, this is not a one-person issue. This is normally a very systemic thing. It's something that affects everyone that's involved, and we all end up in our own little roles around this. And so it's not for shame, it's just the way that it goes, right? And so I think that, you know, it's important for anybody who could be impacted to reach out for assistance. And so one of the good things that's kind of come out of this whole COVID pandemic situation is that there's so much online, so many Zoom resources, you know, things that we never thought to do before. I mean, obviously being in person is great, but, you know, being in person sometimes is really hard. Sometimes it's just not accessible. But being able to Zoom into meetings and Zooming into resources, so I know that this slide is like really small and very condensed, but all of those links are to different types of online meeting sites, whether it be 12-step meetings, whether it be, you know, SAMHSA, the National Alliance for Mental Illness. Like, there's a lot of information on this slide that you can kind of click in and go around and see all of the different online Zoom resources. And you can even just Google it, because again, it's something that is kind of, I think, a positive that's come out of this, because things have become more accessible. We're more comfortable sitting in front of the computer and doing webinars such as this. And so there definitely can be some gains from that. And so that is my end. And if you have any questions, we can take them.
Great, thank you so much. This is a wonderful presentation, Audra. Thank you.
Yes.
If you have any questions, please drop them into the Q&A box. These slides will be available on our website afterwards. So that last slide with all of those wonderful links, you'll be able to download and look at those links there. So there was a comment saying this has been very helpful. Many times it's the all or nothing approach, meaning just cut it out, you're abstinent or you're a failure. So if you're having alcohol use problems, you are labeled an alcoholic and shaming. And so this is an approach that does not work for all. So thank you for giving different options for that. And I just also had a comment as well, another comment. Love the quote that you said, that the mind that brought you into this situation is not the same mind that can get you out of it. That, I mean, I think that's a really important to remember, you know, that, you know, we have to have patience, and the steps you used were really amazing. Thank you. Another comment, a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for the info and the resources. I have clients who do not have access to technology, so they miss out on the Zoom meetings due to not having a smartphone. Are you aware of any phone support groups?
Oh, no, I'm not aware of any phone support groups. That might be something good to look up. So that would be somebody who can't do the face action, just be like phoning in. I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. That's definitely something we can look into. Thank you. Okay, great. And you know, there is the option with Zoom that if it's a Zoom meeting and you can't show your face, you can just call into the call-in line. Okay, great. All right, is there any other questions? I think it's been such a wonderful hour. Thank you so much. So thank you, Audra. A lot of amazing information and a lot of great tips and tricks for us to use. So I'm just going to take a quick minute at the end here to share our website as well. So we have our NAMI New Jersey website that we have all of our local online support groups as well. Let me hit the right button. Okay, great. So if you go to our website, this is our homepage, and the first slide in our scrolling slide is the COVID-19 page. If you click on that link, it will bring you to our page that has all of our support groups, our online services right here. So you'll see our online support group services. We have 3 family support groups and 3 connection peer support groups a week. And if you click right here to our webinar series, this is where you can find all of our upcoming and previous webinars, including today's webinar right there with Audra. And this is where you'll see the slides. I'll show you a past webinar. You'll see the video here, the bio, as well as the PowerPoint slides. So within the next few days, that will change here as well. And all of our programs here at NAMI New Jersey are volunteer and no cost. So we'd love to have you join. If you click on our Get Involved, you can become a member very easily, and we'd love to have you as part of our community. So Audra, thank you so much for your participation and this amazing webinar. Thank you everyone for your attendance today, and have a great day. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.